Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and coming here to Canada in terms of what's happening in Ottawa. Well, there has been a major political debate emerging in Canada over whether the federal government should prioritize buying military equipment from Canadian companies instead of relying heavily on the United States when it comes to its defense contracts. This is increasingly at a time where we're seeing that the relationship between the two countries, have been not the best since President Trump took office for his second term, and he started his entire rhetoric on Canada becoming the 51st state, calling back then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau Governor Trudeau, and essentially triggering Canada into an election, which obviously was a really good thing to see what Canadians would vote for. But since then, we had the relationship kind of restart with Canada and the United States, with Prime Minister Mark Carney going over to the White House. And from that day, essentially, we didn't hear President Trump talk about the 51st state, but it did not stop him from his tariffs and of course, escalating those tariffs. And then when the negotiations were taking place for CUSMA, which is really important for Canada, essentially, we saw that, if you recall the ad that Ontario Premier played in the United States, the $75 million ad, essentially highlighting that the Republican President Ronald Reagan was against tariffs. And to that, of course, President Trump reacted very negatively. It ended the talks. And with CUSMA review around the corner on July 1st, essentially, we are looking at what it means in the greater conversation of essentially, buying Canadian. This has been something that Canada's been stepping up since last year and making sure that it supports Canadian companies, and it's of course the interprovincial trade that we need, of course, with what they call the 13 economies, because it was harder to trade within Canada between the provinces and territories, and it was easier to trade with the Americans and Mexicans because of CUSMA, and prior to that, NAFTA. So, now the sentiment is, you got to buy Canadian. And to that, it has to do with the defense contracts. And of course, Canada's just reached its 2% of GDP for its NATO member commitment. And so now there's this debate of, why is Canada depending so much on the United States as before when it comes to, its defense contracts? And can Canada change that to become more self-reliant? Now, there is a growing pressure on this government, on Carney's government, to overhaul Canada's defense procurement systems during these tensions and worsening relationships, I guess, with the American counterparts, but also what is the greater strategy beyond President Trump? Because I think President Trump came into office and really highlighted how dependent Canada is on America. It's got, America as its number one customer. 70 to 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. 90% of Canadian oil goes to the United States. And so really it's created this bigger conversation of that, even after President Trump's out of office, what is Canada's sovereignty? What is Canada's reliance on another country? And what if, whoever becomes president next has the same sentiment as President Trump? Should Canada just really be, relying on another country for its economic growth? And of course, the two countries, share one of the biggest borders. And of course, it's only natural for Canada to work very closely, and it's been beneficial for Canada when it comes to its relationship with the United States, as it's the world's superpower, a country with the greatest GDP, and Canada benefits heavily from that. But when can Canada become a little bit more intelligent and smart in terms of how it could benefit more from its own natural resources when it comes to its own oil and for domestic use, and of course to be able to export it to countries that need it the most in the Pacific, in East Asia and Pacific Asia. So that's the conversation that we're having nowadays in terms of what it means for Canada. And to that, of course, we know that, Canada has now reached its, defense targets, but, who are they giving these contracts to, right? It's okay, it's spending what it said it would as a commitment as a NATO member, but is it spending that money, the defense money, on Canadian contractors? And are there available Canadian companies to spend that defense money on, right? That's one thing to, invest in Canada, but can Canada compete when it comes to the likes of the United States on some of these things? So of course, that's the central issue, right? So should Canada use its rapidly increasing defense spending to build a domestic defense industry? Since, this wasn't something that Canada was considering before, and it wasn't top of mind before, what we've seen happen with the American counterparts. And the other side is, or should Canada continue relying on this US made systems because they're faster, and and this is a way to be able to get closer to our American allies with negotiations around the corner, right? So now that this debate really does impact preparing for potentially a massive military purchase that Canada is driving towards. I mean, this prime minister is talking about 120,000 jobs in the defense industry, right? We know that, the amounts that he's spending on military, we're talking about, a defense bank even, right? So this is really new for Canada, the level of amplified aspect of this, right? Before, Canada was spending 1.4% of its GDP for its military. Now it's come up to the 2% of its GDP. So now this will be on major military purchases, right? We're talking about submarines, we're talking about fighter jets, we're talking about drones, we're talking about missile defenses, we're talking about Arctic security systems, naval vessels, artillery systems. So, with Canada under the pressure to meet the NATO defense spending benchmark that it's already reached at the 2% of GDP, Ottawa is now reviewing this $19 billion, for example, this one contract of F-35 fighter jets purchased from the United States. And this is at a time where, Canada has definitely noticed how much it depends on the United States. So this $19 billion contract, the question is really highlighting, should it go to the United States? And if it shouldn't, who should it go to? Because does Canada have the capability to do that? Because the United States is really one of the world's biggest arms dealer, right? I mean, this is one of their biggest industries, right? So if you wanted to go to market fast, obviously you would go to the vendor, and in this case, the country that can give you access at a faster rate. So now Canada is legally committed to funding for its first 16 F-35s, but the broader fleets are in review, and that review continues on what to do afterwards. So first 16 F-35s go to the United States. What about the rest of all the stuff I talked about, right? So under discussion is reportedly including Sweden's Saab Gripen fighter jet. Canada's also considering up to 12 new submarines. We're talking about rocket systems, Arctic defense upgrades, new destroyers, naval support ships. It's actually scary to talk about all of this stuff, because I think Canadians want world peace, and we're, heavily talking about how everyone's going to military arm themselves. And when you have those stockpiles, or when you have, do you just, is it something that would prevent another country to come at you, or do you actually use your inventory? So, it is changing times, are rapidly changing times, right? So now with this economic nationalism, right, to buy Canada strong, support Canada, right? Now this government is going to have to start looking at their defense spending, right? Like, what is the industry policy, right, around this? Are there going to be job creations for Canadians? What does the supply chain look like, especially when it comes to security measures? And how do you have the sovereignty, protection of sovereignty, right? And this is one of the biggest discussions. And when it comes to U.S. dependence of, Canada, the questions, it does depend on the United States, but what is its plan from becoming less dependent, right? When it comes to American weapons, U.S., maintenance contracts, right? You buy, right now you buy a car from a company, if you're going to do your maintenance, checkups are going to go back to the manufacturer of that car, right? Same thing happens when it comes to American weapons. It's going to be U.S. maintenance contracts, right? And what does that mean for foreign supply chains? And of course, all of that, right? And so procurement has to be kind of looked at to see, where should Canadian dollars go, hard-earned Canadian dollars, and especially at a time where we're in this sort of a situation with the United States. Now, some important stats around this is that the NATO target is 2% GDP, right, on defense. F-35 deal value is $19 billion, and that's for the first 16. Planned F-35 fleet is about 88 aircrafts. First approved batch are the 16 jets, and proposed submarine purchases up to 12 submarines. And when it comes to procurement discussions around HISMARS is about $5 billion. So not, small change at all. And, this is what right now what we're looking at in terms of everything when it comes to Canada sovereignty, Canada strong, and what it means with its relationship with the United States. Now, there's that conversation, and now we have also some poll numbers. So we have CTV News and Nano's poll, right, that they do together. Essentially, Nano's is showing that there's been a major shift in Canadians' attitude towards defense spending. They're saying that they actually support, before there was support for, not having this massive military spend, but now it's showing that the support is low for when it comes to what it used to be at the 1.4%. And there's a massive, sharp increase of support at 61% for Canada reaching its 2% a GDP mark for, NATO membership. So Canadians who were polled, essentially, they said that, they were comfortable with this significantly higher military budget. They're saying that essentially global instability, Russia's war in Ukraine, that's on year 4, Arctic security concerns, and we know that because of Russia, United States, talking about purchasing Greenland, and of course China. So those are all tensions that Canadians are aware of, with what's happening with the state of the world. And of course, the uncertainty of the Canada-US relations. And even if there is the next president who is very pro relationships with Canada, I think this was a massive wake-up call with what Canada went through, with what President Trump really, woke us up to, right? I mean, when he took office on his second term, he just brought up Canada. He went through his inauguration, and then it was tariffs, immediate 25%, if you recall. And that was a big, I guess, punch in the face for Canadians, and a gut and in the behind to say, hey, what are you doing, right? Like, what is the big plan here? So here we are. And, we're seeing that when it comes to key findings of support, we're seeing that Canadians are increasingly supporting, the direction that things are going with this defense spending. Right now, defense spending exceeds $63 billion annually across government. The poll sample of Nano's poll was 1,099 Canadians. It was conducted between March 31st and April 4th. And the margin of error is plus minus 3 percentage points. But what this also shows is that, you have your 61% of Canadians support increased military spending up from 41% back in 2020. So, this, 5.5 years, really a lot have changed. And Canada plans to increase defense spending towards potentially 5% GDP. That was something that was floated around, by President Trump, that really 2% basic standard should really be 5%. So you have, that also showing in the numbers that, should this defense spending go up to 5% GDP by 2035, and this is under discussions in NATO. And when it comes to defense investments that are projected to be supported, we're talking about 65,000 jobs overall. Over 5 years, it's been said it's about 120,000 jobs, and this attributes to the $7.7 billion of GDP for just from the years 2025 to 2026. So this is, new times. And the latest numbers are out about Canada's labor market, showing weakened numbers for the month of April as unemployment rate rose to 6.9%, the highest level in 6 months, while the economy lost 17,700 jobs. And that was mainly driven by sharp decline in full-time employment. The report that was released by Stats Canada essentially, showed the what it means for Canadians. Specifically, the number of unemployment has been, at this rank since January of 2026 up to now. The 6.9% is a drop from the 7% unemployment rate of last year, September to December of 2025. But, this is at a time where economists are saying that this ongoing trade uncertainty, right? When there's so much uncertainty in the Canadian market, it's very hard for Canadians to invest, whether it means, purchasing a new home, whether it means growing their existing business, whether it means hiring more employees. Just it's slowing down hiring, and and there's pressure in goods producing sectors that are weighing on the labor market. And so once when, like we see in this war with the United States, US, Israel, Iran war, we see President Trump, start the week off by saying, hey, there's going to be a deal made. And we see the stock market actually, stabilizes when it comes to oil prices. We saw this happen the last few months. And then by Friday, he says, oh, we're going to go back to war. And then we see the spike in oil prices, right? And so same thing when it comes to the uncertainty of this trade that's going to be, the Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement, the uncertainty around in terms of what Canada's going to get, and not hearing the best from President Mark Carney, really, lowering our expectations of what is to come from those trade agreements, renegotiations, that it creates a lot of uncertainty for when it comes to, growth, when it comes to investment and all of that. So the key stats released by Statistics Canada is that Canada lost 17,700 jobs in April. Full-time employment fell by 46,700 positions. Part-time jobs increased, though, by roughly 29,000 jobs. Unemployment rose to 6.9%, up from 6.7% in March. Youth unemployment is actually the most. It climbed to 14.3%. Wage growth slowed down to 4.8% year over year, and participation rate edged up to 65%, meaning more Canadians were actively looking for work. And we know that's the case also with the youth. About 500,000 just can't find a job. When it comes to good producing sectors, number of jobs lost were 26,800, and Ontario's unemployment rate was previously 7.6% in March, which again is one of the highest in Canada. When it comes to the economic angle, the numbers suggest that hiring is slowing. Obviously, employers are more cautious and the economy is losing momentum. However, when it comes to wage growth, it remains above inflation numbers. Layoffs are still relatively low, and economists say that the weakness appears tied to more to slower hiring than mass layoffs. So, in terms of the growth strategy is a little bit slower than as opposed to getting rid of, mass amounts in terms of layoffs. So now markets are now watching whether the Bank of Canada may eventually need to cut rates again if labor conditions continue to deteriorate. A new report out from Fraser Institute is essentially warning that Canada is experiencing what is an extraordinary surge in youth unemployment. So now, despite the country not being in a recession, the study is arguing that young Canadians are facing one of the worst labor market deteriorations in decades, with rising immigration levels and higher minimum wage. Wages identified as some of the key factors for this massive unemployment numbers at 14.3% for youth. I mean, I recall, starting in the job market, it was very easy to get a job when you were a youth, like whether it was in retail sector, if you recall going to the mall and really seeing, a lot of youth working in those retail stores, or if you went to the movie theater, you'd see, a lot of youth working in the cinema, or, amusement parks and whatnot. So it's really tough because it's also at a time where, we do have an educated workforce. Youth are graduating from schools and graduating with debt as well. And of course, cost of living is high. And when it comes to them even being able to pay rent at those high rates, let alone being able to invest in property. So, the report does, from the report that was released by Fraser Institute, says that unemployment among Canadians aged 15 to 24 climbed sharply from just 10% in 2022. If you recall, that was during, the COVID era, lockup, startup. And now it's climbed to 13.8% in 2025. It's the largest 3-year increase ever recorded outside of an economic downturn. So very significant, saying, hey, we're not in a recession, but what's happening to youth unemployment? Youth unemployment rose from 10% in 2022, now 13.8% in 2025 for that age bracket, right, of 15 to 24. And then when it comes to the latest numbers released, we're looking at 437,000 young Canadians who cannot just find work. They're saying, they've looked for work and it's not happening. And so that is up from 290,000 young Canadians who couldn't find a job back in 2022. So that's, you're looking at a massive uptake of 147,000 young Canadians. The unemployment gap between youth and adults hit 8 percentage points. That's very significant. It's near the highest ever recorded outside of 1982 recession. So these are staggering numbers here in 2026. Canada's youth unemployment rate now is 3.8 points higher than the United States. So that's 13.8% versus the 10%. When it comes to teen unemployment, which is ages 15 to 19 as considered as teenagers, that's reached 19.5%. Retail and food service sectors, the traditional sectors where youth have been able to traditionally get employment, were roughly, 70% of youth jobs, where it's concentrated in those sectors, saw that youth employment declined while adult employment increased. So essentially, those sectors relying on retail and food services more on adults than in youth. So Fraser Institute essentially is arguing in this report that that government policies created a labor imbalance, essentially by saying that a rapidly increase of low-skilled labor supply through immigration created some of this, and of course, while simultaneously raising labor costs because of minimum wage increases. So saying, because of immigration, mass immigration that Canada went through, that created what would be low-skilled labor, but also availability of labor, in terms of more supply than demand, and minimum wage going up. And essentially now we're seeing the latest numbers is that these employers, whether it's in retail or food services, are saying, okay, well, wages are up. So, should we hire more skilled labor, which is adults versus youth? And we're seeing some of that play out right now, right? Everything's interdependent. That's why it's so important that the laws that a country, at a government level passes, will have effects coming down. Like, for example, we're just looking at immigration numbers, what were the effects long term when it came to Canadian infrastructure, housing, just infrastructure like the roads, right? Traffic or jobs. And so some of this is what Fraser Institute is saying it's related to, right? So, and then of course, you can't ignore what's happening with AI disruption and the fast rate of this AI, super intelligence race that we know is going to impact. And we've heard it from executives at these AI companies saying that, yeah, there will be jobs that will not exist. Of course, with every technological, disruption or innovation, as you would call it, creates new jobs, new opportunities. But what does it mean for a mass scale of people essentially, running out of jobs that once used to exist that were traditional jobs? So Now, the latest numbers, that we announced is very high. Canada's overall unemployment rate at 6.9%. Youth unemployment has climbed to 14.3%. And of course, this will impact when it comes to housing affordability, when it comes to people getting married, having a family, right? Growing their family bases. Of course, mental health is a serious concern in terms of, productivity, right? Earning, output. And, when it comes to student debt repayment, we do have an educated workforce. And what are the long-term earning potentials? And of course, with a lot of things changing at a rapid pace when it comes to technology, really. So those are some of the concerns that were, in this report. But it's at a time to be able to reflect on, the state of Canada. And I mean, here's my personal belief. My personal belief is that Canada will bounce back because Canada is a country that, has, human rights laws. It has infrastructure. It has an educated workforce. It has abundance of natural resources and critical minerals. It has trade agreements around the world. It has a great reputation around the world. And so, I think right now is a critical time that us voters are electing people with good ideas, right? Really good ideas that, and asking like, how would they implement these in a practical sense? And then that they could articulate to us that, the legislation, the laws that they pass, how it's going to impact Canada in, the, not just in the immediate years, not just a decade, but, long term. And so that's why today, when I had the interview with MP Garnett Genius, I asked him about, what is the government doing? Like, are we considering, if AI company and high level executives, owners of AI companies are saying, there's going to be, jobs that will disappear. Yes, there will be new jobs that will appear, but what will be the ratio of that? And at a time where we're seeing what some say is an AI boom with, startups that are just AI companies being valuated in billions and billions of dollars overnight. And with this AI race and where investment dollars are going, essentially, at a time where AI corporations are bringing in massive revenues that obviously, and we're seeing mass layoffs of, even Meta announced, thousands of job layoffs, and other tech companies as well saying, hey, they need to invest that money that would have gone to an overhead to pay employees to really invest in their AI upgrades and infrastructure. So the question remains, right? If more people are not working because of this new age of AI, that also means less income tax for the government. The government spending comes from taxing, right? Taxation. And so if there's less, income tax, what does that mean? And this whole conversation about AI companies talking about universal, income, right? Give everybody $2,000, for example. That's not going to make you rich. It's supposed to just pay for your basic necessities because of the diversification of jobs and, the job market looking very different. But then also questions, well, where is the government going to get that money for universal income? Even if it is something that it would consider, where are those revenues coming from? And that's why today my question to the MP was like, should government be looking at, a special tax bracket for corporations that are AI companies, right? AI corporations. That would be obviously separate to other corporate taxes. So these are conversations we need to have, and things that we'll be looking to see, our politicians really thinking that far ahead, and not playing catch up like we are right now because of our relations with the United States and our high dependence on the United States. That's all the time we have on Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh. Until Monday, take care and be well.